Welcome! Today we're diving into a huge question, one that sits right at the intersection of faith, flags, and freedom. We're going to be exploring a really powerful theological framework that gives us a unique way to think about the often blurry lines between our spiritual lives and our civic lives.
So, let's just put this central question right out there. How should a person's faith actually guide them as a citizen? It's a tough one, right? Well, to find some answers, we're going to dig into a specific framework that has been shaping this exact conversation for centuries.
All right, so where do we even begin? Well, it all starts with this foundational idea, God's two kingdoms. This is the absolute core doctrine that's going to shape our entire discussion today.
So, what is this doctrine of the two kingdoms? You might have heard it connected to big names like Martin Luther and John Calvin, and the core belief is pretty straightforward. God rules the world, but he does it in two totally distinct ways. First, there's the spiritual way, ruling over the hearts of believers. That's the spiritual kingdom. And then there's the civil way, ruling over all of creation to keep public order. That's the civil kingdom. This means, from this point of view, Christians are citizens of both of these realms at the very same time.
Okay, let's break this down a little more clearly. On one hand, you have the spiritual kingdom. Think of this as the internal world, right? It's the realm of the church, of your conscience, what the sources call the inner man. It's ruled by the gospel, and its main concern is salvation and eternal things. Then, on the other hand, you have the civil kingdom. This is all about the external world, the state, our public behavior, the outer man. And this realm is governed by natural law and what's called the sword. Its whole purpose is justice and keeping public order. You know, a really great way to think about this is like having two completely different toolboxes for two very different jobs. The spiritual kingdom is all about governing our inner man. Its tools are the church and the gospel, and they're designed to change hearts. Meanwhile, the civil kingdom is focused on our outer man. Its tools are the state and the law, and their job is to manage public behavior. Two different realms, two different toolkits.
Okay, so that's the theory. But what does this dual citizenship actually look like in the real world? Let's get into the practical side of things and explore the specific duties it involves.
So, according to this framework, civic duties are taken really seriously. And that's because civil government is seen as an institution that God himself established. This means things like obedience to the law, paying your taxes, showing respect to authorities, and even praying for your leaders. But, and this is key, it also includes active engagement, advocating for what's considered righteousness and justice out there in the public square.
But, and this is a huge but, that obedience isn't a blank check. There's a crucial exception, and it's captured perfectly in this verse from the book of Acts. We must obey God rather than men. This single line introduces this idea of a higher, ultimate allegiance.
And this gets us to what's known as the principle of disobedience. The core belief here is that submission to the state is not absolute. So if a government tells you to do something that God's law clearly forbids or forbids you from doing something God commands, your ultimate loyalty has to be to God. Submission is only required in all things lawful.
Okay, so let's take all this theory and apply it to something that's, well, pretty hot button right now. We're going to use this whole two kingdoms idea as a lens to analyze the arguments that are swirling around the idea of Christian nationalism.
First things first, we need a clear definition. What are we actually talking about here? Well, based on the sources, Christian nationalism is a political ideology that wants to formally merge a national identity with the Christian faith. And a big part of that is often seeking to have the state officially recognize the country's Christian heritage.
So from that two kingdoms perspective we've been talking about, what's the big theological critique of this idea? Well, the central problem that gets pointed out is that it blurs the lines between the two kingdoms. It's seen as trying to use the tools of the civil kingdom, things like law and state power, to accomplish the goals of the spiritual kingdom, which is all about changing hearts through faith. It's like trying to use a hammer to bake a cake. Wrong tools for the job.
And this critique really drills down into three specific dangers. First, there's the risk of idolatry, where loyalty to the nation could be put on the same level as allegiance to Christ. Second, a potential distortion of the gospel, basically turning a spiritual message of grace into a political tool. And third, the issue of coercion and exclusion, the danger of using civil law to force religious belief on a society with many different beliefs.
A really common argument you hear in favor of a Christian nation draws a parallel to Old Testament Israel. But this theological framework makes a really sharp distinction. It sees ancient Israel as a completely unique theocracy that was set up by a special, one-time divine command, a model that just cannot be replicated. In contrast, the New Covenant Church is seen as something totally different. It's universal, made up of people from every tribe and nation. No single modern nation gets to claim Israel's unique covenant status.
Okay, so if the goal isn't political dominance, then what is the goal? How does this framework say Christians should influence the world? Well, it all comes back to that idea of using the right tools for the right job.
This framework lays out two really distinct ways to think about influence. The primary way is through the church's spiritual mission, what's called the Great Commission. That's all about making disciples, teaching, planting churches. But then there's a secondary way, and that's the cultural influence that comes from individual Christians, just living out their faith in their everyday jobs and communities.
And this whole idea of individual influence, it's actually rooted in a very old concept called the cultural mandate. This goes all the way back to the book of Genesis, and it's seen as the original commission from God for all of humanity to be fruitful, to multiply, and to cultivate the earth. Basically, to build culture in every area, from science to art to government, for His glory.
So let's get practical. What does living out this cultural mandate actually look like? Well, in your job, it can mean serving with integrity and excellence. In your community, it means engaging in acts of justice and compassion. When it comes to politics, it's about supporting just leaders and good policies. And in the arts and education, it's about creating and supporting work that points to truth, goodness, and beauty.
Now, you know what? This all brings us right back to that incredibly famous quote that just perfectly sums up this entire concept. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. It just so perfectly captures that central tension and the proposed solution of what it means to hold dual citizenship in these two kingdoms.
And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. In a world that is so often divided by politics and national identity, this entire framework really challenges each of us to ask a pretty fundamental question. Where does my ultimate allegiance truly lie?